When a car accident leaves wealthy businessman Julian Harrington in a coma, his controlling mother Ellena seizes control of everything, including his young son Max. But when a compassionate teacher named Celeste enters their lives, she sets off a chain of family secrets, betrayal, and ultimately redemption that will change the Harringtons forever. Don't forget to subscribe to catch more inspiring stories like this one. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love hearing from our global audience. Julian Harrington stared at his reflection in his office window, watching the city lights twinkle below. Another late night at Harrington Enterprises, but that's what it took to stay at the top. His phone buzzed. Another missed call from Max's nanny. Third one this week complaining about his son's behavior. Julian sighed, rubbing his temples. 7-year-olds weren't supposed to be this complicated. Mr. Harrington? His assistant Sarah poked her head in. Your mother's on line 1. Again. Julian groaned. Tell her I'll call back tomorrow. She says it's about Max. Something about him acting up at school. Of course it was. Ever since the divorce, his mother Ellena had appointed herself chief critic of his parenting skills, as if she had any right to judge after the cold way she'd raised him. Fine. Put her through. Julian picked up the phone, bracing himself. Hello, Mother. Julian, darling, we need to discuss Maxwell's latest incident. Elena's voice dripped with disapproval. Fighting on the playground? Really, what kind of example are you setting? He's just going through a phase. All kids do. This wouldn't be happening if you'd let me handle his upbringing. A boy needs structure, discipline, not a parade of nannies who couldn't care less about his development. Julian's jaw clenched. I'm handling it, Mother. Max is my son, not yours. Clearly you're not handling anything. You're too busy with work to even notice he's crying out for attention. If your father were alive, don't. Julian cut her off. Don't bring Dad into this. I have a meeting to get to. He hung up before she could respond, knowing he'd pay for that later. But right now he had bigger problems. The Morrison deal was falling apart, and if he didn't save it, the whole quarter would be shot. Julian grabbed his briefcase and coat, heading for the elevator. The meeting was across town, and he was already running late. Rain pelted against the windows as he rushed to his car, newspaper held over his head. Traffic crawled through the wet streets. Julian drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, checking his watch every few minutes. His phone rang. The nanny. Again. He sent it to voicemail. Whatever crisis Max was having would have to wait. Lightning flashed, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. Julian squinted through the rain-streaked windshield, barely able to see the road ahead. He should pull over, wait it out. But the thought of Ellena's smug face if he missed this meeting. The light turned yellow. Julian pressed the gas, determined to make it through. He never saw the truck that ran the red light until it was too late. Metal screamed against metal. Glass shattered. The world spun in a sickening blur. Julian's last thought before everything went black was of Max's face, tear-stained and angry the last time he'd seen him. The next days passed in a fog of beeping machines and hushed voices. Ellena swooped in immediately, taking charge of Max and the company. Temporary measures, she assured the board of directors, until Julian recovers. But days turned to weeks, and Julian showed no signs of waking. Max visited daily at first, clutching his father's limp hand and begging him to wake up. But as time passed, Ellena decided the visits were too traumatic and limited them to once a week. The nanny quit, unable to handle Max's increasing outbursts. Eleanor hired a replacement, then another and another. Each one lasted shorter than the last. Max retreated further into himself, speaking less and less. He needs discipline, Eleanor insisted, enrolling him in a strict private academy. Structure will sort him out. But Max only grew more withdrawn. He spent recesses alone, refusing to play with other children. His teachers reported he barely spoke in class. When he did talk, it was only to ask when his father would wake up. 3 months after the accident, Max slipped away from his latest nanny during a trip to the park. He found a quiet spot behind some bushes and finally let himself cry, great heaving sobs that shook his small frame. He didn't notice the woman approaching until she spoke. Are you all right, sweetheart? Max looked up to see a kind face framed by dark curls. She knelt down beside him, offering a tissue. I'm Miss Baker, Celeste, she said softly. I teach at the elementary school down the street. Would you like to tell me what's wrong? Maybe it was her gentle voice, or the way she didn't demand he stop crying. Whatever the reason, Max found himself pouring out the whole story. His father's accident, the endless parade of nannies, his grandmother's cold disappointment. Celeste listened without judgment, occasionally squeezing his hand in comfort. When he finished, she pulled a small package of cookies from her bag. "My mother always said cookies make everything better," she smiled, offering him one. And you know what? She was usually right. For the first time in months, Max felt the tiniest spark of warmth in his chest. He took the cookie, managing a wobbly smile in return. Neither of them knew it then, but that simple act of kindness would change all their lives forever. A new story was beginning, one of healing, hope, and the unexpected places where love takes root and grows. After their first meeting in the park, Celeste couldn't stop thinking about the sad little boy with the tear-stained face. She started spending her lunch breaks on the same bench where she'd found him, hoping to see him again. On the third day, her patience was rewarded. "Miss Baker!" Max's face lit up when he saw her. This time his nanny was nearby, talking on her phone and barely paying attention. "Hello, Max," Celeste smiled warmly. "I brought extra cookies today. Would you like to share?" As they sat together, Max opened up more about his life. Celeste's heart ached hearing about the coldness of his grandmother's mansion, the endless rules, and how much he missed his father. She couldn't believe how anyone could ignore this sweet child's emotional needs. "Would you like to draw?" Celeste pulled out some paper and colored pencils from her teacher's bag. "Sometimes it helps to put our feelings on paper." Max's picture showed a small figure alone in a big house, with a sleeping man in a hospital bed nearby. Celeste had to fight back tears. The next day, Celeste did something she'd never done before. She went to visit Julian Harrington in the hospital. She told herself it was just professional concern for a student in crisis, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. The private hospital room was luxurious, but sterile. Julian lay still, machines beeping steadily around him. Celeste sat in the visitor's chair, studying his face. Even unconscious, she could see traces of Max in his features. "Mr. Harrington," she spoke softly, "I know you don't know me, but I've met your son. He's hurting so much without you. He needs his father." A nurse came in to check Julian's vitals. "Are you family?" she asked, surprised to see someone other than the usual visitors. "No, Celeste hesitated. "I'm a teacher who's concerned about his son." The nurse's face softened. "Poor little boy. I see him sometimes when his grandmother brings him. She barely lets him near his father, says it's too upsetting." Celeste's jaw clenched. How could anyone be so cruel? "Does she visit often?" "The grandmother? Oh yes, Mrs. Harrington comes every day like clockwork, always telling him how she's handling everything, running his company, managing his affairs." The nurse shook her head. "Between you and me, she seems more interested in the business than her son's recovery." That evening, Celeste couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Max, alone in that big house with people who didn't understand him. An idea began forming in her mind. The next day, she approached Max's nanny in the park. "I'm a certified teacher," she explained. "I could help Max with his schoolwork after classes. He seems to be struggling." The nanny jumped at the chance to have 2 hours less responsibility. Ellena Harrington's staff knew better than to bother her with such minor decisions. And so Celeste began spending her afternoons with Max. They would sit in the mansion's library, nominally working on homework, but really talking about everything and nothing. Max slowly began to smile more, to laugh even. Celeste taught him silly songs and games, brought him books about adventure and magic, and most importantly, listened when he needed to talk about his father. "Do you think he can hear us when we visit him?" Max asked one day, working on a get-well card for his father. "I believe he can," Celeste answered honestly. "That's why it's important to talk to him, tell him about your day. Love has a way of reaching people, even when they're sleeping." Max thought about this seriously. "Can you come with me next time? Grandmother usually just stands there checking her phone. She doesn't like when I talk too much." Celeste knew she should say no. She was already more involved than she'd planned, but looking at Max's hopeful face, she couldn't refuse. That Saturday, she met them at the hospital. Ellena Harrington's perfectly made-up face showed a flicker of surprise and distaste when she saw Celeste, but she was too well-bred to make a scene. "Maxwell's tutor," Celeste introduced herself smoothly. "I thought I might help him read too. His father today." Elena's lips thinned, but she could hardly object to something so reasonable. She retreated to the corner with her phone, leaving Celeste and Max by Julian's bedside. They took turns reading chapters from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Max curled up in the chair beside his father, more relaxed than Ellena had seen him in months. Celeste's warm, expressive voice brought the story to life, and for a moment the sterile hospital room felt almost cozy. Was it imagination? Or did Julian's fingers twitch slightly when Max laughed at a funny part? Celeste thought she saw movement, but when she looked again, he was still as ever. That night, alone in her small apartment, Celeste tried to talk herself out of getting more involved. The Harringtons weren't her family. This wasn't her world. She was just a teacher who'd stumbled into their lives by chance. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Max's face lighting up when she walked into a room. She remembered how peaceful Julian had looked as they read to him. Something was happening here, something she couldn't explain or control. Just until he wakes up, she told herself firmly. Max needs someone in his corner right now, that's all this is. But deep down, Celeste knew she was already in too deep. The Harringtons were changing her life just as much as she was changing theirs. She just didn't know yet how much everything was about to change. 6 months after the accident, the Harrington mansion had subtly changed. Where silence once ruled, now children's laughter occasionally echoed through its halls. Max's artwork appeared on the refrigerator door, much to the housekeeper's dismay. Small signs of life and joy were creeping in, despite Ellena's best efforts to maintain the house's mausoleum-like atmosphere. "This simply won't do," Ellena declared one morning, finding Max and Celeste having an impromptu picnic in the garden. "Maxwell, you know better than to eat outside like a common—" She stopped herself, but her disapproving glance at Celeste made her meaning clear. "It's such a beautiful day, Mrs. Harrington," Celeste said calmly, "and Max's grades have improved. So much I thought a small reward was in order." It was true. Max's teachers had noticed a dramatic change in him. He was participating in class, making friends, even joining the science club. Ellena couldn't argue with the results, but she hated how they'd been achieved. "Yes, well," Ellena sniffed, "just make sure he changes before we visit his father. I won't have him looking slovenly." After she left, Max's smile dimmed. "Why doesn't grandmother like you, Miss Baker?" Celeste's heart squeezed. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings about change, sweetheart. But don't worry about that. Tell me more about your science project." At the hospital that afternoon, something was different. There was an extra buzz of activity around Julian's room, and Ellena was arguing with a doctor in the hallway. "What do you mean, signs of consciousness? Why wasn't I informed immediately?" Celeste held Max's hand tighter as they approached. The doctor looked relieved to see them, perhaps hoping to escape Eleanor's interrogation. "Ah, you must be Max." He smiled kindly. "Your father's been showing some promising signs. His brain activity has increased and he's had some voluntary movements. These are very good signs." Max's face lit up. "Is he going to wake up?" "We hope so, buddy. It could be today, could be next week, but things are definitely moving in the right direction." Ellena immediately took charge. "Maxwell, say goodbye to Miss Baker. This is family time now." But Max clung to Celeste's hand. "Please let her stay. Dad likes when she reads to us." "Don't be ridiculous," Ellena snapped. "Your father doesn't even know who she is." "Actually," the doctor interjected, "coma patients often respond to familiar voices. If Miss Baker has been reading to him regularly, her presence might be beneficial." Ellena looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, but she could hardly argue with the doctor. They all filed into Julian's room, the tension thick in the air. Max took his usual spot next to his father's bed, while Celeste pulled out their current book. Eleanor paced by the window, her heels clicking against the floor. They were halfway through the chapter when it happened. Julian's fingers twitched, then his eyelids fluttered. Max grabbed his father's hand. "Dad? Dad, can you hear me?" Slowly, Julian's eyes opened. He blinked several times, confusion evident on his face. His gaze wandered the room, taking in the strange scene before him. "Julian, darling," Eleanor rushed forward. "Thank heavens you're awake, we've been so worried." Julian's brow furrowed. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry croak came out. A nurse quickly brought him water. "Max," his voice was rough. "I'm from disuse," but the love in it was clear. "You've gotten so big." Max threw himself into his father's arms, crying openly. Julian held him weakly, his own eyes wet. "Mother." Julian looked past Ellena to Celeste. "Who?" "No one important," Ellena cut in smoothly. "Just Maxwell's tutor. Now about the company." "Miss Baker," Max interrupted. "She takes care of me, Dad. She reads to us and helps me with homework and makes everything better." Julian studied. Celeste with confusion and something else. Curiosity, maybe. "You've been here reading to me." "Yes," Celeste answered simply. Max needed someone to bring him to visit you. It seemed to help him." "It did help," Max insisted. "Tell him about the science fair, Miss Baker, and the book club we started." Eleanor cleared her throat loudly. "I'm sure your father doesn't need to hear about all that right now. He needs rest, and there are important matters we need to discuss." But Julian's attention stayed on Celeste. There was something about her, something in the way Max looked at her with such trust, the quiet confidence in her posture despite his mother's obvious disdain. "Actually," Julian said, his voice growing stronger, "I'd like to hear about the science fair." Eleanor's face darkened, but before she could object, doctors and nurses flooded the room for tests and evaluations. In the commotion, Celeste slipped out quietly, leaving the family to their reunion. But as she walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The way Julian had looked at her with such intense curiosity, she shivered though the day was warm. Back in the hospital room, Julian was already noticing the changes in his son. Max was more animated, more confident than he remembered. What had happened while he slept? And who was this woman who had apparently brought such light into his son's dark world? As the doctors talked about recovery timelines and physical therapy, Julian found his thoughts returning to Celeste Baker, the mysterious tutor who had done what all his money and his mother's iron will could not. She had made his son happy. "I need to know more about her," he said to himself, watching Max cheerfully chat with a nurse. "I need to understand what happened while I was gone." Eleanor, overhearing, gripped her designer handbag tighter. This was exactly what she'd feared. But she hadn't spent 6 months consolidating her power, only to let some schoolteacher ruin everything. "Oh, Julian," she thought grimly, "you have no idea what you're walking into." She pulled out her phone, already planning how to protect the Harrington name from what she saw as an imminent threat. The next few weeks tested everyone's patience. Julian struggled with physical therapy, frustrated by how weak his body had become. Simple tasks like holding a spoon or buttoning his shirt left him exhausted and angry. The only bright spots were Max's daily visits, and increasingly, his curiosity about Celeste Baker. "Tell me about Miss Baker," Julian asked Max one afternoon during a particularly grueling therapy session. "How did you meet her?" Max's face lit up. "She found me crying in the park. The nanny wasn't watching me, and I was really sad about you being sick. Miss Baker gave me cookies and listened to me. She always listens, Dad." Julian pushed through another painful exercise, thinking about this woman who had stepped into their lives so unexpectedly. "And she just started helping you? Just like that? She's the best, Dad. She never talks to me like I'm stupid or too young to understand things, and she makes learning fun. Did you know she helped me win first place in the science fair?" From her corner of the room, Ellena sniffed disapprovingly. "Maxwell, darling, your father doesn't need to hear about every little thing. He needs to focus on his recovery." But Julian shook his head. "No, Mother, I want to know everything I missed. Max, tell me about the science fair." As Max excitedly described his project about plant growth, Julian noticed how confident his son had become. The shy, withdrawn little boy he remembered had been replaced by someone more outgoing, more sure of himself. And apparently, he had Celeste Baker to thank for that. Later that evening, after Max had gone home, Julian confronted his mother. "Why didn't you tell me about how much Max was struggling? About the nannies quitting?" Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. "You were in no condition to worry about such things. I handled it. By letting my son cry alone in parks. That's handling it." "Oh, please, Julian, don't be dramatic. Maxwell was fine. He just needed discipline and structure." "He needed love, Mother, and somehow this teacher gave him what we couldn't." Eleanor's face hardened. "Since you bring it up, we need to discuss Miss Baker. I've had her thoroughly investigated." "You what?" Julian struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed. "It's my duty to protect this family. She's not our kind, Julian. A public school teacher from a nobody family. And she's been spending an awful lot of time here, reading to you while you were unconscious. Don't you find that strange? Suspicious, even?" Julian felt his temper rising. "The only thing I find suspicious is how quick you are to attack someone who helped my son when no one else could." Before Eleanor could respond, there was a knock at the door. Celeste stood there, holding a stack of books. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to back away. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Miss Baker," Julian called out, ignoring his mother's glare. "Please come in. Max tells me I have you to thank for all the stories I heard while I was away." Celeste entered hesitantly, Up close, Julian was struck by her warm brown eyes and the quiet dignity in her bearing. She didn't cower under Elena's cold stare like the nurses did. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "Max thought you might enjoy hearing the endings of some of the books we started." "Mind, I've been dying to know what happened to that hobbit." Julian smiled, surprising himself with how natural it felt. Eleanor stood abruptly. "Well, I can see. I'm not needed here. Julian, we'll discuss those business matters later." After she left, the tension in the room eased. Celeste settled into the visitor's chair, and for the first time they really talked. She told him about Max's progress in school, the little triumphs and challenges, all the moments he'd missed. Julian found himself hanging on every word. "Thank you," he said suddenly, cutting her off mid-story, "for being there for him when I couldn't be." Celeste met his gaze steadily. "Max is a wonderful boy. He just needed someone to see that, to give him space to be himself." "And what about you?" Julian asked. "Why did you get so involved?" "Most people would have just walked away." A shadow crossed Celeste's face. "I know what it's like to feel alone, to need someone in your corner. And once I met Max, I couldn't just leave him struggling." Something in her voice made Julian's heart tighten. Before he could respond, his physical therapist arrived for the evening session. "I should go," Celeste said, gathering her books, "but I left the latest chapter of our story marked. Maybe you'd like to read it yourself tonight." Julian watched her leave, aware of a strange emptiness in the room after she was gone. The therapist had to call his name twice before he focused on his exercises. That night, alone in his hospital room, Julian opened the book Celeste had left. A small note fell out. "Remember, every hero's journey has hard parts, but that's what makes the triumph sweeter in the end. See." He traced the neat handwriting with his finger, thinking about journeys and endings. His mother was right about one thing. Celeste Baker wasn't like anyone in their usual social circle. She was better. Meanwhile, in her office across town, Ellena Harrington was on the phone. "Yes, I need everything you can find on her. Every skeleton, every secret. No one is as perfect as she seems, and I want to know what she's hiding." She hung up and stared out at the city lights, her jaw set in determination. "I won't let you ruin everything we've built, Miss Baker. The Harrington name means something in this town, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." But even as she plotted, Ellena couldn't shake the nagging fear that she might already be too late. She'd seen the way Julian looked at Celeste, the same way he used to look at his late father's favorite paintings, like he was seeing something rare and precious, something that made the world make sense in a new way. "Well," Eleanor thought grimly, "we'll just have to fix that, won't we?" Ellena Harrington sat in her pristine office, reviewing the file her private investigator had delivered. Her red-painted nails tapped against the desk as she read, a cold smile spreading across her face. "Well, well, Miss Baker," she murmured. "Not so perfect after all, are we?" The manila folder contained photographs, Celeste's modest apartment building, her 10-year-old car, her family's small house in a working-class neighborhood. But more importantly, it contained details about Celeste's past, including a bankruptcy, filed by her parents 5 years ago. Ellena picked up her phone. "Get me the board of trustees for the elementary school. It's time we discussed their hiring practices." Meanwhile, at the rehabilitation center where Julian had been transferred, Celeste was helping him with his exercises. Max sat nearby, doing his homework and occasionally looking up to beam at them both. "You're getting stronger every day," Celeste encouraged as Julian gripped the parallel bars. "Just a few more steps." Sweat beaded on Julian's forehead as he forced his legs to move. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one whose legs feel like jelly." "No, but I did teach Max's entire class to dance for the school play. Trust me, that was a workout." Julian laughed, then nearly lost his balance. Celeste steadied him, her hands warm and strong on his arms. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Dad!" Max's voice broke the moment. "Look what I got on my math test." Julian gratefully sank into his wheelchair as Max proudly displayed his A+. "That's fantastic, buddy. We should celebrate." "Can we have pizza in the garden like Miss Baker and I used to?" Max asked hopefully. "I don't see why not," Julian smiled. "Celeste, would you join us? It's the least I can do to thank you for all your help." Before Celeste could answer, Ellena swept into the room. "Julian, darling, I'm afraid you'll have to cancel any plans. The board has called an emergency meeting about the company." "Mother, I'm not ready for—" "Nonsense. You've been doing so well, and everyone is eager to see you back at the helm. I've already arranged for a car to take you to the office." Julian looked uncertainly at Celeste. She gave him an encouraging smile. Go on. Max and I can have our celebration another time. Actually, Eleanor cut in smoothly, Maxwell will be coming with us. Family appearance, you understand. And Miss Baker, since you're here, there's something we need to discuss. Celeste felt a chill at Eleanor's tone, but nodded calmly. Of course. Once Julian and Max had been whisked away, Julian protesting. The whole time, Eleanor turned to Celeste with a predatory smile. Let's stop pretending, shall we? We both know what you're doing. Helping a student who needed support. Celeste met Eleanor's gaze steadily. Please. Eleanor pulled out the file, laying photographs on the table between them. A woman from your background, suddenly spending so much time with one of the city's wealthiest families? How convenient that you just happened to find Maxwell that day. Celeste's hands clenched in her lap, but her voice remained even. If you're implying that I planned this, I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you that it stops now. The school board might be interested to know about your family's financial troubles. Small-town bankruptcy scandals can be so damaging to a teaching career. Are you threatening me, Mrs. Harrington? Not at all. I'm offering you a choice. Leave now while you still have a career. Or stay and watch everything you've worked for disappear. Celeste stood slowly, gathering her dignity around her like armor. You know what's sad, Mrs. Harrington? You have no idea what real wealth is. Max has more richness in his heart than all your bank accounts combined. How dare you? I'm not finished. Celeste's voice was quiet but firm. You can dig up whatever you want about my family's past. We struggled, yes. We lost our home in the recession, but we never lost our integrity. Can you say the same? Eleanor's face flushed with rage. Get out and don't come back. I'll leave when Max and Julian tell me to leave, not before. As Celeste walked out, Eleanor's voice followed her. You have no idea what you're up against. But Eleanor's triumph was short-lived. At the office, things weren't going according to her plan. Julian sat in the boardroom, listening with growing anger, as the board members outlined decisions made while he was unconscious, decisions that had enriched his mother's allies while putting long-time employees out of work. Enough, he finally interrupted. This meeting is adjourned, and tomorrow we're going to start reviewing every single decision made in the last 6 months. Julian, Eleanor protested, you're not thinking clearly. The medication, I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Julian turned to Max, who had been quietly drawing in the corner. Come on, buddy. I believe we have a pizza date to keep. They found Celeste in the hospital garden, still shaken from her confrontation with Eleanor, but trying not to show it. Max ran to hug her while Julian wheeled himself over more slowly, noting her pale face. Are you okay? He asked softly. Celeste managed a smile. Nothing I can't handle. But your mother, she's very protective of your family. That's one word for it, Julian said grimly. What did she say to you? It doesn't matter. Celeste squeezed his hand impulsively. What matters is that you're getting stronger, and Max is thriving. Julian didn't let go of her hand. It matters to me. Their eyes met again, and this time, there was no interruption. Max looked between them, a hopeful smile spreading across his face, but in her office, Ellena was making more calls. If threats wouldn't work, she'd try another approach. By morning, rumors would be spreading through, their social circle about the gold-digging teacher, preying on a vulnerable family. Let's see how your integrity holds up under real pressure, Miss Baker, Ellena smiled, reaching for her phone again. She had more calls to make, more schemes to set in motion. The war for the Harrington legacy was just beginning. The whispers started slowly at first. A raised eyebrow here, a knowing look there. By the time Julian returned to work part-time, the rumors were everywhere. Did you hear about the teacher? One board member's wife whispered to another at a charity luncheon. Apparently she's been plotting this for months, researched the family, planned everything. I heard she's already moved into the mansion, another added, though this wasn't true. Using that poor little boy to get to his father's money. Celeste first noticed something was wrong when parents at school started pulling their children away when she walked past. Then came the emails from the principal about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and avoiding appearances of impropriety. One morning she found an anonymous note in her classroom mailbox. Gold diggers aren't welcome here. She crumpled the note, fighting back tears. Throughout her life she'd faced prejudice and judgment, but this felt different. This time, it wasn't just her reputation at stake. Julian noticed the change too. Business associates who'd been eager to welcome him back now seemed hesitant, distracted. In meetings, he caught people exchanging glances when he mentioned Max's progress or Celeste's name. Finally, his old friend Thomas pulled him aside after a board meeting. "Julian, you know I'm on your side, but people are talking. This teacher, are you sure she's not taking advantage?" Julian's face hardened. "Taking advantage? By helping my son when everyone else was too busy with their social climbing and business deals? Come on, Julian, look at it objectively. A beautiful young woman from her background, suddenly involved with one of the city's most eligible widowers." "I'm divorced, not widowed," Julian snapped. "And what exactly do you mean by her background?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Well, you know, she's not exactly from our circle. And there are rumors about her family's financial troubles. Get out," Julian's voice was deadly quiet, "and tell whoever's spreading these rumors that they're playing a dangerous game." But the situation came to a head at Max's school. During a parent-teacher conference night, Celeste overheard two mothers talking in the hallway. "Can you believe they're letting her continue teaching? After everything that's come out about her? Well, you know how these people are. They see a wealthy man, and—" Celeste stepped around the corner, facing them directly. The women had the grace to look embarrassed but didn't apologize. That night, she called Julian. "We need to talk." They met in the hospital garden, their usual spot. Max was at home with his tutor. Celeste had insisted on hiring someone else to avoid any appearance of conflict. "The rumors are getting worse," she said quietly. "They're affecting Max at school. Some parents won't let their children play with him anymore." Julian reached for her hand. "I'll handle it. We can call a press conference, make a statement." "And say what?" Celeste pulled away. "That I'm not a gold digger. That would only make things worse. Your mother's won, Julian. She's turned everyone against me." "Not everyone, not Max, and certainly not me." Julian wheeled closer to her. "Celeste, look at me. Do you know what I see when I look at you?" She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. "I see the woman who saved my son's soul while I was sleeping, who read to me for hours, not for any gain, but because a little boy asked her to, who faces down society vultures with more grace than they'll ever have." Julian, tears spilled down Celeste's cheeks. "Let them talk," he said fiercely. "Let them spread their poison. They don't know you like I do, like Max does. But your company can survive without small-minded investors. I've been doing some digging of my own, mother's decisions while I was unconscious. They weren't all legal. I have leverage." Celeste's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done letting fear of scandal rule my life. That's my mother's game, not mine." He took her hand again. "Stay. Fight this with me. Show them what real class looks like." Before Celeste could respond, they heard running footsteps. Max burst into the garden, out of breath. "Dad, Miss Baker, come quick! Grandmother's on TV and she's saying horrible things." They rushed inside to find Ellena Harrington giving an interview to the local news. Her face was a mask of concerned dignity as she spoke about her family's difficult situation and her fears for her vulnerable son and grandson. "As a mother," Ellena said smoothly, "I have to protect my family from those who might take advantage of them. And while I'm sure Miss Baker means well," Julian switched off the TV, his face thunderous. "That's it, no more playing nice. What are you going to do?" Max asked in a small voice. Julian looked at his son, then at Celeste. In that moment, he saw his future clearly, and it had no room for his mother's manipulation and social games. "I'm going to tell the truth," he said. "All of it. About the company, about what really happened while I was in the coma, about how your grandmother tried to push away the one person who truly helped us." "Julian, no," Celeste protested. "You can't risk everything for me." He caught her hand, pulling her closer. "I'm not risking everything. I'm finally fighting for what matters. Max needs you, I need you, the rest is just noise." Max wrapped his arms around them both, creating a circle of warmth and trust that no amount of social pressure could break. But across town, Ellena watched her interview replay with satisfaction. "Just phase one," she told her reflection in the TV screen. "By the time I'm done, she'll wish she'd never heard the name Harrington." What Ellena didn't know was that at that very moment, one of her former board members was meeting with the SEC about certain financial irregularities. The house of cards she'd built during Julian's coma was about to come crashing down, and no amount of social manipulation could stop it. The morning after Elena's TV interview, Julian sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of financial documents. His physical therapist had warned him not to overdo it, but he'd been up all night, fueled by coffee and determination. "Mr. Harrington?" His assistant Sarah poked her head in. Mr. Martinez from the SEC is here to see you. Julian straightened in his wheelchair. Send him in. Robert Martinez entered, carrying a thick folder. Mr. Harrington, thank you for agreeing to meet so early. After reviewing the documents you sent, just tell me straight, Robert, how bad is it? Martinez spread several papers across the desk. Your mother's been busy. While you were in the coma, she orchestrated a series of, let's call them creative, financial maneuvers, shifting assets, creating shell companies, backdating contracts. If even half of what's here is true, she could face serious charges. Julian rubbed his temples. And the company? That's the thing, she was careful. Most of the questionable transactions benefited her personally, not Harrington Enterprises. She built herself a nice little safety net, probably planning for the day you woke up. Of course she did, Julian muttered. Mother always has a backup plan. At that moment, his phone buzzed with a text from Celeste. Turn on Channel 5 now. Julian grabbed the remote, and his blood ran cold. Ellena was giving another interview, but this time she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was Amanda Chen, the head of the school board. We take allegations of professional misconduct very seriously, Amanda was saying. While Miss Baker has been an adequate teacher, her recent behavior raises concerns about judgment and boundaries. Ellena nodded sympathetically. It breaks my heart to see how she's manipulated my grandson's emotional vulnerability. Using a child to get close to a wealthy family, it's unconscionable. Julian's hands clenched into fists. She's trying to get Celeste fired. Martinez watched the TV thoughtfully. You know, Mr. Harrington, there's something interesting in these documents about Mrs. Chen's husband's construction company. Across town, Celeste sat in the principal's office, maintaining her composure as he explained that she was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The board feels it's best for everyone, he said, not meeting her eyes, given the publicity. You mean given Ellena Harrington's lies? Celeste stood up. I've done nothing wrong, nothing but care about a child who needed help. Miss Baker, please understand our position. Oh, I understand perfectly. Celeste's voice was steady despite her anger. You're afraid of the Harrington name, but you know what? There are more important things than social status and money. She walked out with her head high, ignoring the whispers that followed her. In the parking lot, she found Max waiting by her car. You're supposed to be in class, she said gently. I heard what they did. Max's eyes were filled with tears. It's not fair. You're the best teacher ever. Celeste hugged him tight. Sometimes life isn't fair, sweetheart, but that doesn't mean we stop doing what's right. Dad will fix it, Max said with complete confidence. He always fixes everything. Before Celeste could respond, a sleek black car pulled up. Julian's driver helped him into his wheelchair, and he wheeled over to them with purpose in his eyes. I need you both to come with me, he said. There's something you need to see. They drove to Harrington Enterprises, where the board of directors was assembled for an emergency meeting. Ellena sat at the head of the table, looking smugly confident until she saw Celeste enter with Julian and Max. What is she doing here? Ellena demanded. This is a private board meeting. Yes, it is, Julian agreed, wheeling to the front of the room. And we're going to discuss some very private matters, like where exactly $10 million of company money disappeared to while I was in a coma. Eleanor's face paled slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. All transactions were properly authorized. By shell companies you created? Julian pressed a button, and financial documents appeared on the screen behind him. Or maybe we should discuss the kickbacks from Mrs. Chen's husband's construction company, the same Mrs. Chen who's trying to get Celeste fired. The board members murmured, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. You're making wild accusations, Ellena said, but her voice wavered. The board knows my dedication to this company. The board should know everything, Julian interrupted. About how you used my coma to enrich yourself, about how you've been using company influence to destroy an innocent woman's reputation, about how you've been treating your own grandson like a pawn in your social games. Julian, darling, you're not thinking clearly. The medication? I'm thinking perfectly clearly, Mother. For the first time in years. Julian's voice softened. Why? Why do all this? We're already wealthy. We have everything we could need. Everything we could need? Eleanor's composure cracked. We have a name to protect, a legacy, and you're throwing it away for her. She jabbed a finger at Celeste. No, Mother, you're the one destroying our legacy. A legacy isn't about money or social status. It's about what we leave behind, what we teach the next generation. Julian looked at Max, who stood proudly beside Celeste. And right now you're teaching my son that money matters more than love, that appearances matter more than truth." The boardroom was silent. Ellena looked around, but found no allies. In the faces watching her, "The SEC has been notified," Julian continued quietly. "They'll want to speak with you, and Mrs. Chen and several others." Elena's face hardened. "You would do this? To your own mother?" "You did this, Mrs. Harrington," Celeste spoke up softly. "Every scheme, every lie, every attempt to hurt people who only wanted to help your family. Those were your choices." Ellena turned on her with fury. This is all your fault. You came into our lives and poisoned my son against me." "Enough!" Julian's voice cracked like a whip. "Celeste didn't do anything except love my son when he needed it most. She didn't plot or scheme, she just cared, something you seem to have forgotten how to do." He pressed another button and security entered the room. "Please escort my mother to her office. The SEC agents will want to speak with her there." As Eleanor was led out, still protesting, Max tugged on Julian's sleeve. "Dad, is grandmother going to jail?" Julian exchanged a look with Celeste. "I don't know, buddy, but whatever happens, we're going to face it together. All of us." The board members filed out, leaving the three of them alone in the big room. Celeste knelt beside Julian's wheelchair. "You didn't have to do all this for me," she whispered. Julian caught her hand. "I didn't do it just for you, I did it for us, for the family we could be." Max wrapped his arms around them both, and for a moment they stayed that way, finding strength in each other. But outside the boardroom, Ellena sat in her office, staring at her phone. She had one card left to play, one final secret that could change everything. With trembling fingers, she dialed a number she'd sworn never to call. "Hello," she said softly. "It's time. I need your help." The day after Elena's downfall, the newspapers were full of headlines about financial scandals and SEC investigations. But in a quiet cafe across town, a different drama was unfolding. "I won't do it," said Marcus Reynolds, staring at Ellena across the table. "Not even for you, Mother." Ellena flinched at the word. 25 years had passed since she'd given up her firstborn son for adoption, a secret she'd buried so deep that even Julian didn't know he had an older brother. "You owe me this," Ellena hissed. "I found you, didn't I? Paid for your education, set you up in business?" Marcus's handsome face hardened. "Yes, in secret, always in secret, because heaven forbid the great Ellena Harrington admit she had a child out of wedlock. I gave you everything, except acknowledgement, except a real family." Marcus leaned forward. "And now you want me to help you destroy this teacher, because she's doing what you never could, actually caring about your grandchild?" Elena's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. "You don't understand. Julian is throwing away everything we've built. For some nobody. No, Mother, you're the one who doesn't understand." Marcus stood up. "I've been watching them. Did you know that? When you told me about this situation, I did my own investigation. And you know what I saw? Love. Real love. Not the cold, society-approved version you believe in." Meanwhile, at the Harrington mansion, Celeste was helping Julian sort through years of financial documents. Max sat nearby working on his homework, but really just happy to have them both together. "Look at this," Julian said, holding up a paper. "Another shell company, but this one's different. The dates go back 25 years. Celeste took the document, frowning. "Griffin Enterprises, and look at these payments, monthly transfers, all to the same account. Regular payments that Mother didn't want anyone to know about." Julian wheeled himself to his computer. "Let's see what we can find about Griffin Enterprises." As they dug deeper, a pattern emerged. The payments had started right after Julian's father died when Julian was just 7 years old. They continued like clockwork, always on the 15th of each month. "Dad," Max called out suddenly, "there's a man watching our house." They looked up to see a figure standing at the garden gate. He was tall, well-dressed, and something about his stance seemed familiar. Julian frowned. "Stay here, I'll handle this." "You're not going out there alone," Celeste said firmly. "Max, honey, go to your room and lock the door. Don't come out until we call you." Together they went to confront the stranger. As they got closer, Julian felt a strange sense of recognition, though he knew he'd never met this man before. "Can we help you?" Celeste asked, her voice steady. The man smiled sadly. "Hello, little brother." Julian's world tilted on its axis. "What did you say?" "My name is Marcus Reynolds, though I was born Marcus Harrington." He held up his hands as Julian recoiled. "I know this is a shock, believe me, I never planned to reveal myself, But when our mother called me, begging me to help her destroy your happiness, I realized it was time for the truth to come out. Celeste gripped Julian's shoulder as he processed this bombshell. Ellena has another son? Had, Marcus corrected. She gave me up for adoption before she married your father. Couldn't have. A scandal tarnishing the precious Harrington name. She found me years later, paid for my silence with those monthly payments through Griffin Enterprises. Julian's mind raced, remembering countless little mysteries from his childhood. His mother's monthly charity meetings that she never discussed. The way she'd sometimes stare at him with a strange, guilty expression. Why tell us now? Celeste asked. Because she called me yesterday after you exposed her financial dealings. She wanted me to help her dig up dirt on you. Marcus looked at Celeste. She thought since I run a private investigation firm, I could find something she missed. Something that would drive you away for good. But you refused, Julian said slowly. I've spent my whole life watching from the shadows as she manipulated everyone around her, watching her twist love into a weapon. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. When she told me about you and Celeste, all I could think was finally someone's brave enough to choose real love over her twisted version of family loyalty. Inside the house, Max had crept halfway down the stairs, listening. Now he ran out to the garden, ignoring Celeste's gasp of surprise. Does this mean you're my uncle? He asked Marcus directly. Marcus knelt down to Max's level, his eyes suspiciously bright. I suppose it does, if you'll have me. Do you like science? I'm building a robot for the science fair. A genuine smile broke across Marcus's face. Actually, I studied engineering before I became a detective. Julian watched this exchange, his heart a storm of emotions. Anger at his mother's lies, sympathy for the brother he never knew he had, fear about what other secrets might still be buried. Celeste squeezed his hand. Are you okay? I don't know, he answered honestly. But I know I'm tired of secrets, tired of letting fear of scandal dictate our lives. He wheeled forward, extending his hand to Marcus. Would you like to come inside? I think we have a lot to talk about. As they headed into the house, none of them noticed Eleanor watching from her car down the street. Her face was a mask of fury as she watched her carefully constructed world crumble around her. So be it, she whispered, pulling out her phone one last time. If Marcus won't help me, there's still one person who will. One person who hates Julian as much as I do right now. She dialed a number she'd saved for just such an emergency. Victoria, it's Ellena Harrington. Remember how you said you'd do anything to get back at Julian for the divorce? I think it's time we helped each other. Victoria Harrington Chase stepped out of her Mercedes, her designer heels clicking against the pavement as she approached. The Harrington mansion. 3 years had passed since the divorce, but she still carried herself like she owned the place. Her carefully made-up face betrayed no emotion, but inside she was smiling. Eleanor's call had been unexpected but welcome, a chance to finally get even with Julian for choosing his company over their marriage. Inside the mansion, the mood was considerably warmer. Marcus had spent the afternoon helping Max with his science project, while Julian and Celeste watched in amazement at how naturally the two had bonded. He's good with Max, Celeste observed softly. Julian nodded, still processing the existence of a brother he'd never known. Makes me wonder what else Mother has hidden from us all these years. The doorbell rang, interrupting their moment of peace. Sarah, who had stayed late to help with the financial documents, went to answer it. Mr. Harrington, Sarah's voice was tense. Your ex-wife is here. The room went silent. Max's face drained of color. He hadn't seen his mother since. She'd walked out on them 3 years ago. Victoria swept in before anyone could respond, taking in the scene with calculated disdain. Her eyes lingered on Celeste, noting her simple clothes and natural beauty with a sneer. Well, Victoria purred. Ellena told me you'd taken up with the help, Julian, but I had to see it for myself. What are you doing here, Victoria? Julian's voice was cold. Can't a mother visit her son? She turned to Max, who had instinctively moved closer to Celeste. Maxwell, darling, aren't you going to hug Mommy? Max shrank further back. You're not my mommy, you left us. Victoria's perfect smile faltered for a moment. I had my reasons. Your father was building his company, Julian cut in, while you were building a collection of lovers behind my back. Ancient history. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. I'm here because I'm concerned. Ellena showed me the news reports. Financial scandals, SEC investigations, and now you're involving our son with some gold-digging teacher. Celeste stood up straight, meeting Victoria's gaze. Mrs. Chase, I understand you're worried about Max, but— Oh, spare me the caring act, Victoria snapped. I've done my research on you, Celeste Baker, daughter of bankrupts living in a tiny apartment, and suddenly you just happen to take an interest in one of the wealthiest families in town. That's enough. Julian's voice cracked like a whip. You lost any right to judge my choices when you walked out on us. Victoria's smile turned predatory. Did I? Because according to my lawyers, I still have partial custody rights. Rights I've been too generous to exercise. Until now. The blood drained from Julian's face. In the bitter divorce negotiations, Victoria had indeed retained partial custody, though she'd never shown any interest in using it. You wouldn't, he whispered. Try me. Victoria pulled out her phone. One call to my lawyer, and I can demand Max come live with me. After all, what judge would choose a scandal-plagued father and his working-class girlfriend over a stable, wealthy mother? Me. Marcus stepped forward. I would. Victoria blinked, thrown off script. And you are? Marcus Reynolds, private investigator, and as it turns out, Julian's brother. He smiled coldly. I've spent the last few years documenting Ellena's schemes. Would you like to know what else I found, like, say, evidence of your offshore accounts? The real reason you divorced Julian. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. You're bluffing. Am I? Marcus pulled out a file. Shall we discuss the money you embezzled from Harrington Enterprises? The real reason you needed that divorce before. Julian discovered the missing funds? You can't prove— Actually, he can. Ellena's voice made them all turn. She stood in the doorway, looking older and more tired than anyone had ever seen her. I kept records of everything, Victoria. Insurance, I called it. Victoria's face contorted with rage. You promised to help me. We had a deal. We did, Ellena agreed, stepping into the room. But watching you now, threatening my grandson, I realized something. I've spent so many years protecting the Harrington name that I forgot to protect the Harrington heart. She turned to Julian. I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I can try to make one thing right. She held out a USB drive. Everything's here. All the evidence of Victoria's theft, all my own misdeeds. Do with it what you will. Max, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly ran to Ellena and hugged her. Everyone froze watching this unexpected moment of grace. Does this mean you don't hate Miss Baker anymore? Max asked innocently. Ellena looked at Celeste, really looked at her perhaps for the first time. She saw not a threat to her social standing, but a woman who loved her grandson purely and completely. No, Maxwell, she said softly. I don't hate her. I was afraid of her. Afraid of change, afraid of losing control, but I think maybe it's time to let go of that fear. Victoria's laugh cut through the moment. How touching, but you're all forgetting something. I still have custody rights, and I will use them unless— Unless what? Julian demanded. Unless you're willing to make a deal. Say a significant payment to keep me comfortable and quiet? Before anyone could respond, Max spoke up. I want to go to court. All eyes turned to him. What? Victoria asked. I want to tell the judge everything. About how you left us. About how Miss Baker helps me with homework and hugs me when I'm sad and makes Dad smile again. About how grandmother is trying to be better. Max's voice grew stronger. I'm not scared of you anymore, Mom. I have a real family now. Victoria looked around the room, seeing the united front before her. Julian, Celeste, Marcus, even Ellena. She'd lost and she knew it. Fine, she spat. Keep your happy little family, but don't think this is over. As she stormed out, Ellena turned to Julian. There's one more thing you should know. About your father, and why I gave Marcus up for adoption. Julian took Celeste's hand, drawing strength from her presence. I think it's time we heard the whole truth, Mother. All of it. Thunder rumbled outside, as if the heavens themselves were preparing for Ellena's final confession. The storm that had been building all these months was about to break at last. Rain pounded against the windows of the Harrington mansion as Eleanor settled into her chair. The others gathered around, Julian in his wheelchair with Celeste beside, him, Marcus, leaning against the fireplace, and Max curled up on the sofa, determined to stay for this final revelation. I met your father, William Harrington, when I was just 17, Ellena began, her voice soft with memory. He was 25, already being groomed to take over his father's company, and I was the daughter of his family's housekeeper. Julian and Marcus exchanged shocked looks. Their grandmother's status in society had always seemed as natural as breathing. We fell in love, Ellena continued, but when I got pregnant with Marcus, William's father threatened to disinherit him if he married someone of my background. She looked at Celeste. Ironic, isn't it, that I would later do the same thing to my own son? What happened? Julian asked. William wanted to defy his father, give up everything for love, but I couldn't let him. I saw how brilliant he was, how much good he could do with the company. So I disappeared, gave Marcus up for adoption, let William believe I'd had an abortion. Tears slid down Ellena's cheeks. A year later, William's father died, and William, he spent months searching for me. When he finally found me, he didn't care about my background anymore. He married me, adopted me into his world of wealth and privilege. But the guilt of giving up Marcus, it changed me. You became obsessed with status, Marcus said quietly, with proving you belonged. Eleanor nodded. I thought if I could be perfect, if I could make the Harrington name even more respected, it would make up for what I'd done. When William died, that obsession only grew stronger. I was terrified someone would discover my humble beginnings, would try to take everything away from us. So when I fell in love with Celeste, Julian began, I saw myself, the young girl I used to be, but instead of feeling compassion, I felt fear. Fear that history would repeat itself, that the social circle I'd worked so hard to build would reject us. Ellena turned to Celeste. I convinced myself you were a threat, when really you were a mirror showing me how far I'd strayed from who I used to be. Max, who had been listening intently, spoke up. But you were brave in the end, grandmother. You helped stop Victoria. Eleanor smiled through her tears. Only because you showed me what real bravery looks like, sweetheart. You and your father and Celeste, you were all willing to risk everything for love, just like William and I once were. She stood, moving to a cabinet in the corner. From it, she withdrew an old, worn photograph. This was taken the day William and I reunited, before I learned to hide my real smile, to measure every word and gesture. The photo showed a young Ellena, radiant with joy, being twirled in the arms of a man who looked remarkably like Julian. I'd forgotten, Ellena whispered. I'd forgotten what real happiness looks like, what real love feels like. Julian wheeled closer to her. Mother, what are you going to do now? First, I'm going to turn myself in to the SEC. No deals, no legal maneuvers, just the truth. She straightened her shoulders. Then I'm going to do what I should have done 25 years ago, publicly acknowledge Marcus as my son. The scandal, Marcus started, will be nothing compared to the scandal of denying my own child. Eleanor reached for his hand. If you'll let me, I'd like to try being a real mother, to both of you. Julian looked at Celeste, who nodded encouragingly. I think we'd all like that. Max jumped up. Does this mean we can have more picnics in the garden? And can Uncle Marcus help with all my science projects? And can Miss Baker... Celeste, Eleanor corrected gently. I think it's time we called her Celeste. 6 months later, the Harrington mansion was transformed. The austere furniture had been replaced with comfortable pieces that could withstand a child's enthusiasm. Photos lined the walls, not just the formal portraits Eleanor had once insisted upon, but candid shots of their growing family. Eleanor had served 3 months of house arrest and was now doing community service, teaching business skills at a women's shelter. She'd discovered, to her surprise, that her real-life story of rising from humble beginnings inspired others far more than her carefully crafted society persona ever had. Marcus had moved his private investigation firm into the city and was becoming a regular fixture at family dinners. His engineering expertise had helped Max win first place in the state science fair, and the trophy held pride of place in the living room. Victoria had signed away her custody rights in exchange for immunity from prosecution for her financial crimes. She'd moved to Europe, where she could pretend the whole scandal had never happened. And Julian had finally regained the ability to walk short distances, though he still used the wheelchair for longer periods. But his greatest recovery had been emotional, learning to trust love again, to believe in second chances. On a warm spring evening, the family gathered in the garden where Max had first met Celeste. Fairy lights twinkled in the trees, and chairs were arranged in neat rows. Max, handsome in his little suit, proudly carried a ring pillow down the aisle. Eleanor, elegant in pale blue, sat in the front row beside Marcus, dabbing at her eyes. As Julian stood at the altar, supported by a decorative cane but standing on his own 2 feet, when Celeste appeared in a simple white dress, carrying wildflowers, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. She practically glowed with happiness as She walked toward Julian, toward their future. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Max couldn't contain himself. "Can I say something first?" he asked. When the minister nodded, Max turned to face the guests. "A long time ago, I was really sad and lonely, but then Miss Baker found me in the park, and she gave me cookies, and she helped me be brave. And then she helped Dad be brave too, and then Grandmother learned to be brave again. And now we're all brave together." Laughter and tears mingled as Max finished his impromptu speech. Julian squeezed Celeste's hand, remembering that dark day when he'd first awakened from his coma to find a stranger in his house. Now he couldn't imagine life without her. "I love you," he whispered as the minister continued the ceremony. "All of you. The teacher, the healer, the mother, the friend, every part of you that helped make us whole again." Celeste's eyes shone. "And I love all of you. The businessman learning to be human again, the father who'd do anything for his son, the man brave enough to choose love over society's expectations." As they kissed to seal their vows, Max cheered and Ellena wept happy. Tears. Marcus caught her hand, squeezing it in forgiveness and understanding. The sun set over the garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The Harrington mansion, once a cold symbol of wealth and status, had become a true home. Within its walls, a family had been broken and remade, stronger for having faced the darkness together. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, they all danced in the garden. The teacher and the businessman, the private eye and the reformed socialite, and one very happy little boy who had started it all with his tears in the park. Sometimes they knew love comes disguised as loss. Sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest dawns. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to trust your heart, you find that family isn't about blood or status or society's approval. It's about the people who stay by your side through the storms, who help you find your way back to the light, who teach you that the greatest legacy any family can leave isn't wealth or power or social standing. It's love, pure and simple. Just love. The end.